All right, good evening, everybody. May I have a motion to re-enter open session? Motion by Ms. Weiss, second by Ms. Mamalito. All in favor? 5-0. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the
To the
flag.
flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
All right, thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. Tonight, we have two action items on our agenda, and they are as followed. We have two change orders. Does Ms. Dunkel, do you want to go over the change orders, or do you want us to go through them first?
Whatever you prefer.
I'd prefer if you would speak about them first before we vote
Sure.
on them. You will? Thank
Sure.
you.
So the first change order for the $62,580 relates to the South tennis courts. When the construction started on the tennis courts, they found that the asphalt that is just above the sub base of the tennis court floor was not as thick as as is required. So originally the bid called for them to do some milling, which essentially is them taking up the asphalt that exists there, remixing it, and then replacing it, or reusing it, I should say. So because the thickness of it is less than 2.5 inches, they cannot reuse that. They have to now reinstall new asphalt. So the cost for that is the $62,000. Debbie?
Did they not do a core sample prior to?
No, they did do boring samples throughout all of the tennis courts, and all of the tennis courts showed that the thickness was above 2.5 to 3, which is where it needs to be. But when they actually started the construction, the portion of the tennis courts, the south tennis courts, are actually less than that. So that, because they do sampling across the different courts, the areas that they did meet the requirements, but when they actually got to construction, it did not. And it's only on the south tennis courts. It's not the entire tennis courts. It's just the south tennis courts. So that's why they need a change order. It's called a discovered condition, which happens often in construction projects. So that is the explanation for the first item. The second item, which is more expensive, the $180,000, has to do with the concrete paving at John Glenn High School. That project was awarded to Laser. Laser is doing all of the exterior pavement and cement work at the high school right now. So all these change orders are to that specific company. The bond originally called for replacement, if you're all familiar with the concrete outside the walkways throughout John Glenn High School, there's red brick and then concrete. There's red brick outlining the concrete walkways. So the bond called for replacement of the brick only. So now that we're now 4 years later into the projects, by the time it was awarded and this work has taken place, in order to replace the red brick is being replaced with concrete. And when you pour the concrete, now there's no way for them to evenly pour the concrete and have it match up to the concrete that already exists on the walkways. So in order to make it a one smooth surface and avoid any tripping hazards or any other safety issues for the students and staff, they need to replace the concrete in certain areas throughout the walkways and sidewalks throughout John Glenn High School campus. So that's what the second change order is referencing.
And that's
called for. Go ahead.
And that's not something that should have been in the original scope of work, that they couldn't see that the bricks were, obviously pouring concrete is never going to match, new is never going to match old. I
asked that same question, Debbie, because I was a little, I'm not a construction expert. I spoke with our architects and engineers, and according to the original bond that was issued when the bond project was put together, at that point they were only looking at the bricks. And again, maybe in 4 years there's been that much of a shift, or I don't know. I believe it to be somewhat of an oversight. I'm still working, I'm still talking to the architects about that, but it is a good question. But yes, I thought that was kind of odd myself. Why would you replace the bricks without replacing the concrete? But because of how the bond was drawn up and the bid was issued, the bid only called for replacement of the bricks.
Yeah.
The good news, not that it's good news, but the overall project for this particular phase, the budget for that was roughly 2.4 million. The bid award was for 2.1 million. So we had a little bit of leeway. So now with all the change orders that are being processed, we're still $175,000 under budget for this particular project for all of the site improvements. So we are keeping track of that as well.
I'd ask Dr. Bossert that question as far as the monies that are going to be allocated towards this work, given our tight budget and all our COVID-related expenses, that this money was going to be coming from the bond monies, not from the general fund. And I know that to be the case.
Yes.
Just community's clarity, I think that's important to put on the record, that they know that those monies are going to be coming from the bond work that was already approved from the referendum report, and not from the budget that was just passed in June.
Right.
So-
Yeah. Each project has a certain amount of allowance in it. So that, in addition to having the bid come in under budget, has helped us out. But like I said, even with these improvements, we're still $175,000 under budget. But there is one other item to be transparent. I just wanted to bring to your attention regarding the tennis courts. There's a concern that because of the lack of thickness on the asphalt, that there has been some damage to the sub base below it. So they haven't been able to proceed in certain sections of the tennis courts because they're waiting for the change orders to be approved, if in fact they are approved. There is a potential for an additional change order coming down the road if the sub base needs to be repaired as well. Because we can't lay down a new tennis court if the sub base is not properly compacted.
Do we have any recourse? I mean, it's so old, but the prior contractor, if there is a flaw in installation, how does this become all of our issue?
That's something I'm looking into, Heather. Those records are buried downstairs. I mean, capital projects you have to keep forever, but I'm working with John McDonald to find out who did the prior projects and who installed the tennis courts and things like that, just to find out exactly, if there is some type of warranty that could possibly still be in play. But it's a reach, but it's worth looking into. So I am doing that with John.
There's an
What are the
installation
chances?
defect and they weren't using proper, sub base. I mean,
It might have been at that time though, Heather. It might have been like, that might have been the
Right. There may have been different requirements.
standard,
I'm not
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
yeah,
What are the
well,
chances
most
that-
of it was where it should be, and then the other part of it was short. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It
Right.
just-
Yeah. For some reason, the
all
thickness
the
in
way
the south courts, are less
Okay.
than what they should have been.
Were all the courts installed at the same time, or was the south court
No.
installed first?
This actually, according to Mr. McDonald, the south courts are the more recent courts.
More recent ones.
Yeah.
And the base that possibly has to be the sub base, the cobblestone that
Mhm.
goes on the bottom underneath, that is throughout the all the courts, or just the south court?
I believe that's only for the south courts as well.
So the south
I'll get clarification on that,
Yeah.
but I believe
The
it's
south-
So you
south.
may have a point, Heather. It may be like,
courts are newer, but they have more problems.
Yes.
Well, the South
Yeah.
Court typically had drainage issues, so that might have been the play. And I think we've also gone ahead and resurfaced the courts multiple times since the original installation. So, who knows what was done, what machinery was done to compact from when we resurfaced them ourselves.
When was the original installation of the court? Like, how old are the courts that were?
I believe
Because
I
they all have
asked.
a lifetime.
Yeah, I believe
usually.
I asked John that. I don't want to give you wrong information, but I believe it was more than 10 years ago. But I'm not 100% sure. I can look into that and get back to you, Sarah.
No,
But yeah, I
mean,
think
it-
as
yeah.
James mentioned, I think drainage was an issue because part of the explanation that the contractor has now, regarding the thickness, is to achieve proper grades for the water runoff. So that was probably part of the issue.
How much might that be additional?
They were not able to give me a number at this time.
And how much wiggle room do we have left in our?
We have for this particular portion of the bond, we have about 175,000.
Okay, thank you.
But Tom, just so you know, there are other portions of the bond where we have been under budget. So that as long as the achievement of the bond is to stay under budget in its entirety. So right now we are slightly ahead of the game overall.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Dunkel.
Sure.
Yeah, and to Mr. Tamio's point about how funding for the capital bond never comes from the district's operating budget, I think it's important for the community to also understand the capital bond project will also never go over budget. We put together assurances of our A priorities and then our B list that we hope to achieve. And the more that our A list priorities stay at or under budget, the more items on the B list we'll be able to check off using capital bond funding. However, that insulation that is purposefully developed into the bond pays for items that become items of discovery. One of the things that we cautioned both the board and the community at the time the bond was passed is you never know what's underground till you truly start to dig. And although soil samples and drainage work you can predict, it is unknowns like this that often occur. The only time where these change orders need to come to the board for public discussion is when the variance is greater than 15%.
It's $25,000.
$25,000, thank you. It was 15% for this project. $25,000 is something that the board has to approve, so it'll be a part of public discussion, but it is not at all unusual for slight variations, either greater than the estimate or in better cases, less than the estimate when we do. This is one of the things that, when you pass a bond, when you do the work, when you do the specs, as long as 4 years ago, when we're talking about the concrete project, that there will naturally be variations between what was proposed and what the actual expense is. The good news is we are aware of that when we present the bond to the community, when we create the estimations, when we work with our construction managers and architects. So as long as we are within our budget, we are safe. And our overall bond allocation, we are well within and have the necessary flexibility for any additional unknowns or surprises that occur when we do our priority work. We're hopeful that we save as much as possible so we can check off B list items, which we would love to have. But as long as all of the A priorities are financially secure, we are working within the correct parameters that we promised the community.
How many A projects we have left to go in Elwood?
Quite a number, Mr. Scrolla. The schedule of all the projects and when they are to be done is posted on our website for the community's knowledge, and we tend to check them off after they're complete. But we are only a small percentage into the overall work that was approved by the community.
And credit to BBS and to Laser Inc. for finding this. I mean, I would hate for them to have gone forward and lay the tennis courts down improperly, and then we had issues going forward as we've had in the years past. So unfortunately that it is an expense that was unexpected. It's much better to pay now than to put the kitchen wall up and have to re-gut the plumbing later on.
Right.
So, all right.
Well said.
All right. I will, if there's no other questions, going to move forward with our action items. And thank you, Ms. Dunkel.
You're welcome.
Alrighty. So, as I said, we have two action items this evening. Action item in regards to the change orders. Be resolved upon the recommendation of the superintendent of schools, the board president, and the superintendent of schools hereby authorized to sign and execute the following change orders. Change order number 5 for Laser Industries Incorporated related to the reconstruction of the south tennis courts at Elwood Giant Gun High School in the amount of $62,580. And change order number 6 for Laser Industries Incorporated related to the additional concrete replacement at Elwood Giant Gun High School in the amount of $108,552. May I have a motion for those two change orders? A motion by Ms. Weiss, second by Dr. Siddiqui. Questions or comments? I think we did that already. Seeing none, all in favor? 5-0. Thank you. And moving on to our second action item is to approve a multi-year service agreement with Western Suffolk BOCES. The recommendation is to be resolved that upon the recommendation of the superintendent of schools, the Board of Education president, and the superintendent of schools are hereby authorized to sign and execute a multi-year lease agreement with Western Suffolk BOCES and the district, setting forth the terms and conditions for providing Chromebooks and other technology-related services to the district with financing under COSER A501.020 for the 2020-2021 school year as presented to the board at this meeting. And said agreement will be incorporated by reference within the minutes of this meeting. May I have a motion for this action item? Motion, Mrs. Mamalito, second by Mrs. Weiss. Questions or comments?
May I add a comment?
You may, Dr. Bosser.
I appreciate the board's anticipated support of this motion, as this would enable the district to supply a one-to-one Chromebook to every student K-12. This fills in the gap of resources that we had from a technology perspective, so that if we find ourselves in a distance learning model, our students can be learning from a similar, if not uniform, device across the district K-12. It also, at the recommendation of the technology committee, begins our transition to the Chromebooks with the touch screen in place for a full grade level of students, as is our desire to do eventually on a K-12 basis. While this was an unbudgeted item, and we had to create some allowances with BOCES for the late nature of this request, we feel this is an essential expense due to the hybrid nature of the program that we'll be offering in the fall, and to insulate us in the likelihood that we end up in a distance learning environment on a full-time basis. We want to make sure all of our students have the same technology resources.
So we did have a motion on the floor by, I believe, Mrs. Mamalito, seconded by Mrs. Weiss. Questions or comments? I will comment and say thank you to the administration for working with Western Suffolk BOCES to provide the equity across the line. That's very necessary and appreciated. So we have the motion, the second. All in favor? 5-0, Ms. Marks. That concludes our action items. May I have a motion for an adjournment? Motion by Mr. Scarola, second by Dr. Siddiqui. All in favor? 5-0. Thank you, everybody.